So in this episode, we're going to talk about URL design and what we can do to improve the regular resources routes that come with Rails. So what we've created so far is a bookstore application. We've added the Bootstrap gem and the Better Errors gem, and I've taken a few steps to create the scaffold for the books model, and they just have a title and a short description. So if we take a look at this book that I've already added, and we go in here and we take a look at the URL, we see slash book slash one. Now this is the default from Rails. It's a regular resource route, and the one represents that this book is the first record in the database. Now that's great, but if I am trying to access this book from a search engine, the search engines know that URLs should be designed for your users, and your users aren't going to understand what database ID is for this book. So your search engine results are improved slightly if you have the book title in the URL. So how do we go about doing that? Well, one approach is to add the title of the book right next to the name. So we could, for example, have How to Win Friends and Influence People. The reason why we don't want to just dump the title in there and lowercase it is because there's spaces, and we don't generally want spaces in the URL. We'd be better off having dashes. Now, how do we do that, however? How do we generate this URL when we create a link to the book title and include the database ID? Because with this URL, we will still pull out one, and that's how we'll pull out this book from the database. We'll still do the regular book.find with the params ID, and it will take this whole thing and convert it only to the number at the beginning. Now, let's take a look at how that works in the console. So if we come in here and we open up the console, we can take a look at this string. So I'm going to paste this in as a string. And if we convert this to an integer, just like how it was before, it was simply an integer number 1, we receive that same number 1. So the toI method knows how to start from the beginning, pull out an integer, and then ignore everything else that's not a number. So that's really helpful, and this is actually what Rails does internally when you call the find method. If you pass it a string, it converts it to an integer. So this still works. Now, how do we create that in a Rails application? Well, we actually have a string in the database called how to win friends and influence people. And we have this string, but we need to convert it to the dashed version that's also lowercase. So how do we do that? Well, Rails provides a parameterize method that allows you to do this automatically for any string. So if we hit enter, you'll get a deprecation warning, but this is something you can ignore for now. And the result is the correct downcased and dashed version of this. So imagine your book has an ampersand in the title, and you call parameterize. An ampersand is actually something important in the URL that you don't want to put in there unless you know exactly what you're doing. So parameterize will filter that out just like you would expect. So what we can do is we can tell Rails that, okay, we want to add the database ID, a dash, and then the parameterized title of the book. So there's a method inside of the model that we'll jump into right now that we can modify to make this happen. So we'll edit anyways. And so if we come into the book model and we write a method called toParam, this allows us to take the book, and when you pass it into a link to, for example, let's pull that up real quick. You're probably familiar with a link to. It's a very common method of linking to a different URL. You pass in the book object. In this takes a look at the method toParam that Active Record Base provides. So what we do when we add this method, we're overriding Active Record Base's normal toParam method. So we're going to define it how we want to, and this will be great. So this will automatically handle everything for you, which is awesome. So if we take this and we add the ID and interpolate that, as well as the book title, and parameterize that, then we can save this, and this link to now, this part will call toParam, and it will generate this to put inside the URL, and we can go back to the home page, book name, and we can go back to the home page, and if we click on it, we get the new URL. So we've automatically changed this to pretty URLs without doing really any work aside from adding one method, which is really cool. But there's some drawbacks about this. A user still has to remember the database ID, and that is not necessarily a problem for your application. So for example, if you are Amazon and you have this book, but you have it on hardback, paperback, Kindle, audiobook, and so on, it's okay to keep the database ID in the URL because you have a lot of complexity here. There's essentially duplicates of the same book. And that's okay. You wanna know how your application works and think about this. But what if you want to take this and get rid of the database ID in the URL? What if you want to find by the parameterized version of this title? Well, this is something we would call a slug. So this is a converted version of the name attribute of the book that we convert to a parameterized version, and we want to look up the database ID based upon this. So our database actually needs to add a slug field, and before the record gets saved, we convert it to this format. So let's go take a look at how to do that. So let's add a slug attribute to the book model in a migration. So if we run Rails generate migration, and we call it add slug to books, and we add the slug string to the book model, and we run our migrations, we will now save this slug every single time that the book saves. So let's open up our book model. We'll hop into book.rb, and here we want to update the slug every single time the book's name changes. So that's something that we need to do on every time just before we save it. So Active Record provides these before methods, and we can say before save, let's update the slug. Now the symbol update slug delegates to a method called update slug, and in here we can write whatever code we want. So what I'm going to do is say self.slug equals the name.parameterize. So this will take and downcase and get rid of those extra characters as we talked about before, and then it will assign it to the book's slug attribute. So the important part to note here is that self.slug is different than saying slug equals name.parameterize, because here inside of the book, this line is going to create a local variable called slug, and it's not going to get saved when you write this to the database. So you want to make sure you run self.slug when you're assigning attributes inside of the model. So if we save this, when we go back to our application, we can update the book, and then this will have saved the slug, and we can see that if we run Rails console, and we grab our first book out of the database, you can see the slug attribute is correctly set to the parameterized version. Now this is great, but we have to go do one more change before we can get actually two more changes before we can get going further. First one is that we need the toParam method instead of our custom string that we built. We just want it to be the slug. So if we come back to our homepage and we look at the link to how to win friends and influence people, down here at the bottom in Chrome, there's the little gray hover, and it says books/how to win friends and influence people. When we click on it, the URL is correct. However, we got an active record not found because it looked for a book with the ID equal to that string, but that's not right. The slug is this value. It's not the ID. So we need to go update the controller to handle this. Part of the reason why you want to consider all these things is because before, with this method of toParam, we never had to update the controller, and that's really awesome. So you get the benefits of doing a little bit better URLs that are more friendly to your users, but you don't even have to update the controller. So if we go into the controller and we jump down to our setBook method where it crashed, for example, you can see here, line 67. This is part of the benefit of better errors. You get to see exactly what went wrong and you can actually interact with it right here. So we know that the params ID is correct, but book.find isn't looking for the right thing. So when we come in here and go to the book.find, we want to find by slug rather than find where it looks by default for the ID. So if we refresh, now our page works. So this is really cool. However, if we edit this and we give it number 2 and we update the book, there's actually the number 2 in the URL. So this is kind of a problem because if we remove this, that book at the same location no longer exists. So we need to be a little bit careful there and pay attention to, okay, if the URL changes, is that okay? Is it okay that Google no longer can index that page? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. You need to pay attention to that and make sure that you know exactly what you're doing there. If I delete that and update the book again, that is correct. So we can't just delete the number 2 out of the URL and get back to the book where it was before. We have to actually update the book, and that changes the URL. So you have no history as to what the old URLs used to be and what they are now. So this is kind of, it gets complex very quickly, as I'm sure you've noticed. You start out with one little change to put words in the URL. Well, that influences a little bit of other code, and then you get to this point and you're like, oh no, we have lost history and we've lost all these things. It looks prettier, users can remember it, but it's actually more complicated this way. So what we're going to do in this episode now is take a look at Friendly ID. So Friendly ID is what they like to call the Swiss Army bulldozer of slugging and permalinks. And URLs like this are also called permalinks pretty often. So this is a gem that allows you to sort of ignore all the complexities of this. I wanted to make sure that you understood what we're actually getting into before we dive into this. Like, this topic is actually pretty complex and an important part of designing every web application that you build. So Friendly ID is very, very nice. It does exactly what we were talking about before. It allows you to say, /state/Washington rather than state/an ID number. It also, they didn't mention the 1-Washington or whatever, but that is more of a middle ground hack that isn't ideal for your users, and the goal really for building good software is that it's ideal for your users. So there's a lot of information here. I recommend reading through all of it. For example, if you have duplicates, they provide you different methods so that you can say this URL, rather than adding -2 on the end, they can add a city or a street in the city and so on. So you can really differentiate them a lot better. However, this is also like default. They can do UUIDs and whatever. So lots to learn about this gem, and I'm just going to walk you through the basics, which is under this Rails Quick Start. So as usual, don't grab the gem line from your readmes in your gems. Rather, go to rubygems.org, grab the gem file line, and put that in your gem file. So we'll do that right now. I guess I have an old version here. So we'll save that, hop into our terminal, run bundle to install it. It's installed, and then let's go back to our README and take a look at what we need to do next. So first we need to run the friendly ID generator, and this is going to create a table for us to keep track of the friendly ID slugs and whatever else that they have, as well as an initializer file. So we can take a look at that right now. Config friendly ID. And this has a bunch of options that you can use, and you can look through all these. By default, it's pretty good. I mean, if you want to do something complex, you can absolutely jump in here. They also have reserved words, so this means that you could not have a book with the name of login or logout or admin, which is really good because sometimes people try to attack your website, and they're like, okay, well, if you're going to have twitter.com/my username, what if my username is admin or login, logout? Then that means that you could effectively break Twitter's website if they had not thought about that, where their users could no longer log out because they would be taken to your profile, which would be really interesting. But you need to think about that when you're doing it. So we're going to run this migration, and then we'll take a look at the next step, which is to generate a scaffold for the user model. We don't need to do this. They didn't present this very clearly, but they're basically saying add a slug to whichever model that you want. And we've already done that with our previous example. They do encourage you to use an index on the slug, which I very much agree. So let's go back and make this change. So first we want to roll back twice, because first we're going to get rid of the friendly ID slugs, and then we want to roll back again to remove the slug from the books model. So when we jump into our db migrate add slug to books, rather than having generated it like we did before, we also want to add in, let's grab that. We also want to add in this index so that the database can query this column very quickly. So an index allows you to just query the column faster than you normally would. And it's very important when you're doing queries on it. You want to always try to add an index if you can. So that's done. Let's go back and rake db migrate. Generally, you don't want to edit your migrations like we just did. However, this is in development. We've never pushed those migrations to the server, so it's okay to do that. It'll be cleaner later. Our code will be much cleaner. But the important part is that we've never pushed this to any other computer. It's never been on GitHub. We don't want to edit migrations after the fact. So it's okay to do it now, but don't do it later on. So then we've run our migrations, and we just take the extend friendly ID and put that in our book model, which is very nice. We can paste that in, and what this does basically is it adds essentially the before save and update slug method that we had before, which is very cool, as well as the toParam. So you can just dump that in, and if we take a look at this, the only other change they recommend is that in your controller you call .friendly.find, which means that the other change that we made in our controller before, find by slug, should be .friendly.find. So now, taking a look at our bookstore application, I'm going to restart our Rails server to make sure that we have the friendly ID gem available. And we'll go back to the home page. Take a look at this. Book/1. That is still incorrect, right? So let's update the book and see if it updates the slug, which it did, and that's great. This happens because the record already existed before we added friendly ID. So now we can take a look at that. You can automatically have all of those features that we built by hand by adding .friendly and these two lines, as well as the migration into your application. And this also provides you Friendly ID also provides you a bunch of other things, such as history. So, like we talked about before, when you update the name of the book and the URL is broken, you can save that in the database, and then it will look up the record as well. So you can dive into this, and you can see the history.rb file. This is the uh, code that actually allows you to do that. It creates slugs based upon different parameters, and it has different queries and whatever else. So this, as long as you define this properly, which it looks like you can say use history, this allows you to have the history in your application. So that's Friendly ID. There's a lot to it. This guy has done a fantastic job with it. You can use this if you like. You can also build it from scratch, but it really depends on what you're trying to accomplish in your application with your URLs. Definitely put thought into it because it's one of the most important pieces of a good application. Because you know, look at GitHub. There is not a user ID anywhere or database ID anywhere in the URL. And we can remember that, and that's good. So think about those things and pay attention to them when you're designing your applications in the future.